Hello listeners, and welcome to the last of 2021's weekly content. All of the business before we get started. If you're interested in joining me at CrimeCon 2022 in June, where you can take part in forensics workshops, listen to world-renowned private detectives on exclusive panel talks, and come and spend some time with me on Podcast Row, along with some titans of the podcast industry, you can get your tickets now by going to crimecon.com and use the code CULT at the checkout for a 10% discount. You can also get your tickets today and pay in instalments on the early bird scheme. There's still a few days left to take part in this month's monthly memoir giveaway of Lisa Cohn's book To the Moon and Back, A Life Under the Influence, about Lisa's time in the Unification Church. Just follow, like and comment on any of my social media content and you will be automatically entered. You can find me at CultVaultPod on all social media, and you can email me at cultvaultpodcast@gmail.com. It's still Download December, where we are trying to reach 300,000 downloads by New Year, and we are getting closer every day, so please keep sharing the podcast with everybody. Lastly, before we get to New Year, I wanted to say thank you. Thank you to every guest who has appeared on the show and shared your experiences, your advice and your insight. Thank you to anyone who has listened and shared the show. Thank you to anyone who has left a review, a rating, subscribed on YouTube or followed me on social media, and all of you amazing people over at Reddit. Thank you to every person who has donated to the show. And thank you so much to the patrons of the Cult Vault podcast, the people who make each show possible by allowing me to continue releasing weekly content. Thank you to everyone who makes this show exist and continues to help every day. There is so much exciting stuff in the pipeline for 2022, and I can't wait to share it with you all. Until then, I hope you all enjoy the holidays, I hope you have some rest, I hope you take care of yourselves and your loved ones, I hope you get to eat good food, and I hope you join me next year for more cult content. Now on to the show. This is a 2-part series that I wanted to release before New Year so that I too myself can have some family time. I also wanted to release these episodes together because they tell the same story but from 2 different perspectives. Firstly, we have Bob, who talks us through losing his daughter to a group. And then in part 2 we have Alexandra, the daughter who talks us through leaving home to join the group from her perspective. Both parts come with important messages and are peppered with advice on how to help loved ones. Here is part 2 with Alexandra. So hello, Alexandra. Welcome to the show. Thank you so much for agreeing to come and chat with me today. I have already had the chance to speak with your father, Bob, about his experiences. And today I am looking forward to gaining your perspective on some of the same events. So would you like to start by introducing yourself to the listeners?
Absolutely. Thank you for having me. My name is Alexandra Mena, and at age 16, I joined a cult through a family friend, and I was there for 10 years. And then I spent another, maybe 5 years before I even realized I was in a cult. And then another 5 years or so before I decided to get help. And just to date myself, I joined the cult in 1992 and started sort of my road to recovery officially, I would say, in 2010.
And that's a journey that never really ends. I feel like that's an ongoing thing, process.
Yeah, absolutely. It's ongoing. There's always more to learn and uncover and unlearn.
And what is the name of the group that we are going to be exploring today?
It's Ramtha School of Enlightenment, and it's located in Yelm, Washington State in America.
So it's a place that still exists today?
Yes, it still exists today. The woman who runs it, her name is Jay-Z Knight, and she is a purported channel for a mystical entity called Ramtha. And she started somewhere in, I think, the 70s. And she has a book about her story where, apparently he appeared to her and told her about his, life. He's a 35,000-year-old warrior from Atlantis, and had something to teach her, and basically, which was about, that knowing that you are God or something along those lines. I don't really remember the origin story that well anymore, I realize now, but it's, easily found online. So
if Jay-Z Knight started this in the 70s, she must be kind of older now.
Yeah, I think she must be in her 70s, maybe mid to late 70s, I would say.
Given that brief history of the group, do you remember sort of what the core principles and practices are, if you had to kind of summarize the group to somebody who had never heard of them before?
Right. So the main principle of the group was you are God. You are, your essence is God. And we've just forgotten that. So we, came here from the ethers and were once one with God, and we're God, and have ended up forgetting that. And so Ramtha's role supposedly was to remind us that we are God. And the principles, were kind of based on sort of Eastern mysticism. And one of the cornerstones of the philosophy was that consciousness and energy create reality, which was kind of like a, trademarked phrase. But basically what it meant was that what you think and what you believe creates your reality. Ultimately, you're responsible for everything in your life.
Right. Yeah. So if you are to, you can will something into being. Yeah. So riches or health or relationships. So basically all of the answers to any of life's questions or problems or worries that you might have.
Exactly. It's all within you. And it's a matter of unlocking it. And it's a matter of, anything, like you said, if it's riches or anything, if you don't have it, you want it and you don't have it, it's because there's some part of you that doesn't believe you deserve it, or doesn't believe you are it, essentially. Like we would, the thing about how he would do our disciplines or exercises was that you had to become whatever it was you wanted, and believe it so strongly, or be it so purely and absolutely that it would become reality. And there was a whole pseudoscience behind, how that could happen. So it would be way too much to go into, but it had a lot to do with like quantum mechanics and how the observer affects reality. And so it was actually, kind of fascinating and fun and interesting if it were true.
I feel as if in my mind, I feel I'm very skeptic about things like deities and ghosts and things that people have talked about for years, having experiences with or seeing. And with all the technology in the world today, we've still never had very clear-cut, very obviously not doctored footage of actual ghosts or appearances of gods and these things that people worship and believe in. And I understand that some people use religion as a set of guidelines to live their life, and the whole discussion around whether God is a physical thing or not is a whole nother episode for another day. And I know some people might be sitting there kind of thinking, oh, Casey, you're so one-minded, one-track minded. But with all the technology there is, you'd at least think that if demons were real or ghosts were real and we could see them as apparitions, that there would be footage of it by now. Mm-hmm. But for this group to come forward and have answers to questions through science and research and things that they can write on paper with equations and that, to me, it kind of takes this whole mysticism and journey of spirituality, like it takes it that step further, because I might not be able to understand quantum mechanics, but when somebody says it to me, I'm like, whoa, that's serious. And I know that people like get paid a lot of money to understand all that stuff. So that might go one step further to making people believe that what they are being taught and told has some tangibility to it.
Absolutely. It's impressive, and it's it's validating. So, everybody wants to believe that they are on the side of empirical knowledge, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. And to some people, to be told that the whole practice is to understand that you are God, that must appeal to some people's egos, but also must people that have been through trauma or vulnerability, or been in positions where they have had no control and they've needed that control, or people who are trying to regain a sense of themselves, to then be told that through this practice you are God and therefore you are in control of everything, again must appeal to another demographic of people on top of those looking for answers through science and meaning. And even more dangerous on top of that, to be told that those things aren't coming to you because you're not working hard enough. We're already kind of in that space of wanting so much what is being promised, but never able to reach that point. And we're already kind of in the mental gymnastics of the group that you were a part of for such a long time.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, you're right. It is appealing, because when you're told that, if there's something you want to change in your life, you are in control of that and you can do that, it is very appealing. And plus, you're being told this is some secret knowledge that only you have access to. And so, if you work hard enough, you can do anything, basically. And yeah, very appealing. And I just wanted to say, to your point about, the scientific aspect of it, what this plays on is the fact that, as far as science goes, there is always the possibility that we're going to prove there is a God, or that we're going to discover something new that shows us something that we could never have conceived of today. And so there's a play on that, sort of human potential and all of the possibility that's out there. But at the same time, that very same thing is what every conspiracy theory is based on. It can't be proven, but it also can't be disproven. And that is the ultimate, telltale sign of a conspiracy theory, among other things. But yeah.
Absolutely. And just to kind of take that one step further, if those people in positions of power claim that they have been touched by those things that we want so much to prove to be real, like Jay-Z Knight, for example, and her interaction with Ramtha that she said that she has had. Wow, like if she is now enlightened, or she has the ability to communicate with those gods and deities that we would love to prove were physically real. Like, here's somebody standing in front of us who says that she has that proof, and she is living example of that proof. And that's got to be something quite substantial for people who are on that journey of searching for a higher meaning or a higher power. And and as soon as you said conspiracy theory, I was already thinking in my head, like, people thought that the moon landings would never happen. People thought that they couldn't happen. And then they did happen. But now everybody's kind of like, but did they? So it's like, this thing has happened. We've proved that we can go into space. We've proved that we can visit the moon. And then there's still people that will turn around and say that never happened. And so you can kind of apply this to so many other historical events that have happened in history. But with technology and science and everything moving forward, they said that space exploration couldn't be done, and now it happens all the time with United Nations as well. You kind of have 5 or 6 astronauts on one space exploration ship, and they're from different nations, which who would have thought that was even possible back
Yeah.
during World War I and II, and then everything that happened between America and the Soviet Union. So yeah, you could just draw those kinds of comparisons, I think, all day. And this is just me kind of, again, my mind just working at 100 miles an hour. But let's go back a few steps and talk about you and your upbringing. What was that like? Would you say your childhood? Did you have brothers and sisters? What were your parents like?
Mm-hmm. Well, I was born in New York. My parents were living there. However, my mom is German, and when my parents split up, I was pretty young, I was about 2.5, and within a few years, my mom went back to Germany. So when I was about 4, we moved to Germany, and I spent my childhood mostly there. I went to school there, and throughout that time, I would see my dad during the summers and on vacations and such, but most of my time was spent in Germany. And when I was 14, I decided that I wanted to come back to New York. I had a dream to be an actress, and my life had kind of taken a little bit of a downturn. In my early teens, I was really, really troubled and really had some terrible bad experiences and trauma, and was into drugs and such, and not doing well in school. And one of the things that I thought was like, well, if I could just do what I really want with my life, I would be a little bit more motivated. And so my dad suggested that I apply for a high school in New York that combined the arts and academics. And that was the Fame School from the movie and the show, which really exists in New York. And my dad had actually gone there when he was a kid, but for music. And so when he suggested that, I, made a point to get ready, and I auditioned, and I was accepted. And so when I was 15 or just 14, 15, I came back to New York and started high school there.
Wow. What was that experience like for you? Did you feel like you were in a good place, or you were at the start of a more positive segment of your life?
Well, that's a very interesting question, because I guess, in retrospect, yes, that was good. And it was a positive thing. And I thought I did it for a positive change, which it was. But then, as these things go, I ended up sort of falling in with some not so great people again, and, got back into drugs and all these things. And I think the aspect of me that was troubled and that had experienced some pretty, bad things and trauma that never really got processed, you find a way to act out of that if you're not dealing with it and if you haven't processed it. And I think that's what ended up happening. And that sort of vulnerability I still had ultimately is sort of what led me into being, susceptible to being drawn into the cult.
And your relationship with your father at this point, you lived away from him for so long, and you moved back over to America. Was it comfortable for you to fall back into a kind of, like when you haven't seen a friend for ages and then you see each other and it's like nothing's ever changed, or was there kind of like a trying to reacclimate to some type of normal new every day with your father?
Yeah, my dad and I always had a great relationship. We were very close, and he was very loving. And even though, he wasn't there physically most of the time, he was always in touch and always sending me gifts and letters and all kinds of things. And calling, and he was very present. But that still is different than living together, and when you're a teenager and, you're used to how things have been with my mom, then coming to live with my dad was definitely an adjustment. And my dad was way more strict than my mom. My mom was, just very relaxed and easygoing, whereas my dad was like, you need to tell me when you leave. where you're going, and then you call me when you arrive where you're going. And I was not used to that. And so there was a little bit of a, we clashed a bit. And certainly, like, I was a teenager, so we definitely clashed over sort of my level of independence and how much I should have and how much he didn't think I should have.
Do you think that your father's decision to be a bit more stricter perhaps came from where you were then living? Was there a difference between like civilians and crime rates over in Germany compared to where you were over in New York?
That's interesting. I mean, I guess, New York in the late 80s, early 90s wasn't the safest place, depending on where you were. But I guess I in Germany, I lived in Frankfurt, and Frankfurt is also a big city and very gritty, I guess you could say. And honestly, most of the bad things that happened to me in Germany as a teenager.
Was your father aware of the trauma and the ill mental health that you were suffering with when you came to live with him?
To be honest, I'm not entirely sure. I mean, he knew about the drugs. He knew that I was doing drugs. I mean, I smoked hash and did mushrooms and LSD and things like that. But so he knew about that. He knew about like skipping school and all of those things. I don't know if he knew about. He definitely didn't know about all of the trauma. Like, I had some very bad early boyfriends, and I don't think he really knew the details of all of that. But he was definitely more protective.
Do you think that if he would have known about those things, it may have changed the course of what happened in years to come?
Honestly, I don't know. I mean, I don't know, because I ultimately think he was just doing the best he could to cope.
Absolutely, yeah. And I think that was clear in my discussion with him as well. I guess I'm asking that question from the perspective of any other parents who may be listening with troubled children of their own. We cover a lot of the troubled teen industry on the show, and a lot of the time the young adults end up in these programs or schools because the parents are kind of at their wits' end and not sure where to go next, or how to cope themselves, or how best to support their child. And so they entrust their child over to air quotes professionals, and then the child actually ends up coming out of the programs at times with more trauma than they had before they went in. So I just thought it'd be interesting to ask whether you thought if your father had been aware, if there would have been maybe a difference in what happened. But I guess in some ways it may have been a good thing that he didn't decide to enroll the help of professionals who may have placed you in a facility that didn't help in any way.
Yeah, I mean, I think I don't know, obviously, when it comes to how this might help somebody else, I would say, like, everybody is different, and everyone's parents' relationship with their child is different, and every child reacts differently to different, actions or consequences. I was really rebellious, and I was really, I had a real, if you told me to do something, I was going to do the opposite. Like, no matter, it didn't really matter. It was illogical, right? So my dad trying to be sort of more strict and all of that, I rebelled against that, for sure. I don't know that there would have been anything else that he could have done, like sending me somewhere that would have had a better result, because I think I would have rebelled the same way. But one thing that I think, just maybe also from having my own daughter, who's now 18, what I've learned, when you, as a parent, you can't reach your kid, you just can't get through to them, and something is wrong. Sometimes you have to change your role a little bit, from the parent who wants to guide to the parent that just listens and is there, because I think parents are so, we want to make sure our kids have the right tools and the right guidance, and that they know what's right and wrong and all those things. But sometimes all they really need is to be heard and understood and not judged, and not for the parent not to worry, but rather just be there. And I think that, if there's anything I could say, maybe that's a piece of advice.
I think that sounds great and interesting as well, because I feel like that's almost how, from what I spoke about with your father, that's almost how his relationship with you changed as well as time went on. It kind of went from him trying to be a bit more controlling and setting boundaries to him basically just saying, like, I'm here to listen to you. That's all I want from you, is just to talk to me. So it's really interesting to hear that's kind of the approach that you would take with, if your daughter seemed to be struggling with her behaviors or impulses or her attitude towards you as a primary caregiver, or if she just seemed distant and less and coming to you with less communication. So that's a really interesting thing to explore.
Yeah, and just one more thing I wanted to say about, what could have been done or whatever back then. It was a different time, like now I send my daughter to therapy, and, I make sure that she has all the support that she needs if that can't be me, Back then, I think it just wasn't as common. Not that, my parents did try to send me to therapy, but it just was a much more difficult road. And I don't think there was the same kind of tools and acceptance for that kind of process to get help.
I think there's definitely been huge breakthroughs and positive waves in terms of mental health and the treatment of mental health, and appreciating the gravity of people that do suffer with ill mental health, and trying to treat certain diagnoses as you would somebody with a physical disability or ailment, instead of just saying it's not something that we can see, so it can't be that severe. There's still a huge way to go, but there is definitely a lot more in place now and it's interesting that you mentioned that you did try therapy, because I was thinking in my mind, I wonder if you would have spoken to your father, if he would have said, okay, let's get you somebody to speak to, because these things have happened and there may be somebody who can help you work through those experiences and help you with the tools to recover. But that's something that you did try, and because of the times and because that progression in that sector hadn't happened yet, it wasn't something that worked for you at that time specifically.
Yeah, and I did go to therapy when I was in Germany, and what prompted that was I had a bad relationship, and I was raped by my boyfriend or ex-boyfriend at that point. And I told my mom, and she knew, and so she took me to therapy to talk to somebody. And I went through a couple therapists. The first was not very helpful. The second, I would say, I felt comfortable opening up to and talking to, but I think the style of therapy was more just to listen and not to give any kind of, I think whenever she would say anything that was critical or questioning me, I rebelled again. So I think part of it was just me not being ready, or maybe just the style, or I don't know. But that was shortly before I moved to New York, and then that ended. I think I might have done therapy for 3 months or 4 months.
So just remind us again what age you were when you finally moved back to New York.
So I was 14 when I moved back to New York.
And you mentioned that you first came into contact with the Ramtha School of Enlightenment at age 16.
Right.
So now we're kind of at the beginning of your journey towards finding the school and becoming involved. And so what was your first introduction to the School of Enlightenment?
Right. So my dad had this friend called Bodhananda, And all I knew at the time, and this was, probably I was probably 15, 16, maybe early 16 at this point, was that my dad would meet with him, and they would, he was an old modeling friend, and my dad would teach him how to swim because he didn't know how to swim. And in return, Bodhananda was teaching him some other kind of classes, like fitness classes of some sort. And I always say that, my dad was one of those people that was always had something going on. Like, he was a swimmer, he was, into, at some point, yoga, he was very healthy, he was into all these things. And he would do these, like he did like a 30-day yoga challenge, whatever it may have been. Always, it seemed like always something else. And honestly, like from my perspective, it was like, I don't really think any of this is making a difference. But when he started doing these classes with Bodhananda, and I noticed a difference in my dad. And I think the biggest difference was his temper. He would get mad or whatever. And when he started doing that, he stopped doing it, but he did it less frequently, or he seemed more controlled, or like he was checking himself, before he would, explode, let's say.
That is fascinating to hear that from your perspective, because he talked through about how he would have a conversation with himself in his mind about, okay, so why am I angry? Why am I doing those things? Through the practices that he had been going through with Bodhananda, he started to have these, okay, so I don't need to get angry, or I don't need to react this way because it's happened because of this. So for him to talk about that process that he was going through in his mind, and for you to be able to look at him and be like, why isn't he getting angry? Why is he just stopped all of a sudden? Like, and you're seeing him go through this process. That's really fascinating, I think, to gain your insight on that.
Yeah. And honestly, even though as a teenager, I was happy, and I was glad that he was, more measured, or however I perceived it, it also seemed like it afforded me a little more freedom to sort of do whatever I wanted to do. And looking back, like, I think you have to be okay with your kid not liking you. You have to be okay with your child not accepting your discipline, not accepting your boundaries, because they don't know, but you know better. And for whatever reason, like, even though, like, on a personal level, I was like, oh yeah, this is nice, my dad's a little more easygoing, that isn't what I needed. I needed boundaries, and probably more discipline than I got at that point. And to no fault of his own, he tried. He tried.
I suppose on the flip side of that as well, there could have been the situation where, because it's natural that there is a natural stage during adolescent brain development where children and young adults are supposed to push boundaries and take risks. That is actually a physical, chemical reaction and part of brain development that kids are supposed to take risks and learn where their own boundaries are and how to keep themselves safe. And that is all part of the kind of flying the nest part of development, where the child has to prepare itself to no longer be under the guidance and supervision of the primary caregiver. And as for some people, it may kind of be like, I'm pushing my boundaries, and then your dad takes a step back, and then you're kind of like, why aren't you reacting to me anymore? Why aren't you telling me to stop, like, staying out all hours of the night, or whatever it is that's happening at that time? So I imagine for some people, they could have almost like the opposite, where they're a bit worried that they're not being disciplined in the way that they were before.
Yeah. And I could tell that from his perspective, he was just trying something new. He was giving, like, whatever he had been doing didn't really work. So he was trying something new. And, there's nothing wrong with that.
And the name Bodhananda,
Mhm.
it's an interesting name, and it has a story all of its own. And I wondered if you could just talk the listeners through that as well.
Right. So Bodhananda, that was not his real name. He was given that name when he was with Osho Sri Rajneesh or Bhagwan. So before he came to Ramtha, that's where he was in that cult. And that's where he was given that name. And Bodhananda is a combination of Bodhi and Ananda. And I think it means consciousness in bliss, or the bliss of consciousness. Something along those lines is the combination of those two words. And that's how he became Bodhananda. And yeah.
So he actually went over to Rajneesh's ashram.
Yes.
And had the one-to-one interaction with Rajneesh, where Rajneesh personally gives you your new name and the mala. Is it a mala that you wear around your neck? And and then he followed Rajneesh to Oregon. Mm-hmm. And then when Rancho Rajneesh collapsed, he returned back to New York, where he came back into contact with your father, who he had known through their modeling careers before he went off to India for the first time.
Yeah, I'm not sure that he ever went to India, but he definitely was in Oregon. And, after that period of when that whole Rajneesh thing fell apart, he was back in New York, and then some friend introduced him to Ramtha. I don't remember how that came about, but initially, he wasn't interested, but then, gave it a try and found that it was everything that Rajneesh never was. It was the final answer and whatever. But yeah.
And so Bodhananda is coming to the house more frequently, and you're kind of seeing him around and you're introduced to him. What are your kind of first impressions of him as a person?
Right. So, he was a really charismatic person, and he was, my dad would bring him for dinner, because I think the other thing that was happening is they were working together. My dad was giving him some work, and I think he had no money. And so my dad was wanting to help him out. And some nights they would come over, he would come and spend the evening and have dinner with us. And the interesting thing was that, my dad and he would have conversations that I would overhear, and they were kind of along the lines of conspiracy theories and things like that. But interesting, I think that's the first time I heard about the whole Rothschilds and that whole story. And so that was kind of new to me, but they would talk about things like that. And it was interesting to hear. And as a kid, you don't know how to differentiate what's real or what isn't. And I don't know why, but there was no part of me that said oh, that doesn't sound right. I don't know why. But yeah. And so it was just kind of fascinating. He had a way of talking to you that made you feel like you were really being heard and listened to. And he would probe, he would often, if you were talking about something, he would make a point to address the underlying thing, whatever it may be. So if we're talking about, let's say, the Rothschilds or whatever it was, and let's say I was not really believing it or who knows what, and then he would say, but why is it that you find it hard to believe that? Or why is it that, what is it that's stopping you from accepting this? He would be kind of he would probe a lot. And yeah.
And your father is teaching Bodhananda to swim, and he's returning the favor by having some workshops or classes with your father. What happens in these workshops?
Yeah. So, what ended up happening was, because I started seeing that change in my dad, and he would talk briefly, not much, but he would say, he's taking these classes. And I became interested. And one day I just said, I wanted to try taking the class as well. And, it's funny because, how you sometimes, I said how if somebody tells me I can't do something, then I really am going to do it. Well, both of them kind of were like, oh, no, that's not for you. Like, oh, no, you can't do that. And I was like, oh, yeah.
So you roll up your sleeves.
Right. So, of course, I wanted to do that even more. And then finally, at some point, they let me, or I took the class. And basically, the classes were like exercise classes, but the real sort of purpose of them was that through exercise, you got to like an emotional place that was kind of like took you to your limits emotionally and physically. And that when you got to that place, that's when you could confront anything that was standing in your way. That emotions would come up and feelings would come up and all these different things. And that's what it was about. That's what you had to deal with. If you were trying to do your 10th push-up and you couldn't, it wasn't because you physically couldn't do it. It was because something mentally was holding you back. And so that was like the work, was like dealing with what came up in those places. And then the other thing, part of it was that in doing the physical stuff and overcoming sort of what you thought were your limitations, you became empowered and you found sort of like a place of peace, a place that you felt, was like you could do anything. And so there was this combination of like, well, that's the real you. And that's the you that you want to sort of like foster and build on. And which, some of that isn't wrong. I mean, there's a reality to the fact that when you overcome like physical, difficulties, that it releases endorphins and it's, all these things that make us feel good and empowered. And but the thing that was weird about it was the way that he guided us on what was going on internally and sort of like, suggestion and sort of pulling out this information that may or may not have even been there genuinely.
And is this practice in these classes, is it coming from his time spent with Rajneesh, or is it coming from Ramtha School of Enlightenment, or is it a combination of stuff that he had just designed on his own?
I believe that it was a combination, and my best explanation would be that the classes themselves came from a self-defense program that he took. And the part that we did, the exercise that we did, was their warm-up. It's what they would do as a warm-up before they began the self-defense portion of the class. And I never did the self-defense aspect part of what he did. But the point of this warm-up was to get you so relaxed and so out of your own way, essentially, so that when you were in the self-defense training, your actions and reactions were pure and automatic and nothing was holding you back, kind of thing. So there was that part of it. That was like the exertion part of it, was like just to give it your all, 150,000%. And then the other part of it that I think was partly Rajneesh was sort of the group therapy aspect of it. Like some of what was going on was like this probing and examining your innermost fears and all this stuff. And then the other part of it, which was this like, oh, go to that special place where you feel, your pure self, or whatever you might want to call it. That was a little bit of Ramtha, I think, because it was kind of like being that observer that, was part of that philosophy. And ultimately, I think he did his own thing. He mixed it all up and made it his own.
And I had a profound moment during my discussion with your father at this exact moment, because I had always thought about all of the people that have been victimized and exploited by these types of control methods, and then I had this realization when I was speaking to your father that people that have interacted or followed these cults of personality have systematically taken some of those methods themselves and realized that they could apply it to their own environments and potentially maybe to really help people. Maybe it's not like a nefarious or predatory thing in their mind. Maybe it is. This is where I try not to express too much of an opinion, because I would say that it probably was for those reasons, but that's I never met him, so I couldn't say for sure. But there are people out there who will take these elements and apply them to their own environments so that they can then manipulate and exploit people in the way that the leaders that they have previously followed have done to them and their peers. And that was quite a significant moment for me, because I'd never considered that until that moment with your father, where he said that he had taken elements from the two different groups that he'd been a part of and basically created his own.
Yeah, and honestly, that's not an uncommon thing too for people who have been in situations where they were controlled. They might just be trying to establish their own control over their own life again, kind of thing. It's not uncommon to see that happen. And I do think that his intentions were good. I do think that he thought he was helping. I think he thought he had something really special that he was helping people with. That doesn't mean that he couldn't be a predator at the same time. Yeah, it doesn't mean that his actions weren't predatory.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And perhaps people that go on to do these things have had positive experiences in the groups and movements that they've followed, so they feel like they can then apply those positive experiences to other people by carrying out the same things, but the result may not always be positive for those people that are experiencing those same methods of control or manipulation. So again, it's a very interesting cycle, and it kind of goes round and round, and it's a difficult thing to comprehend. And I imagine there's a lot of things that you can read about it. Like I imagine that this is something that Robert J. Lifton has written about quite extensively. So you are introduced to Bodhananda and his workshops or classes, and you start to take part in them, and they are physically exerting you beyond your physical limits, and your father said that they are so exhausting that you would actually just fall asleep in the room after you'd completed the exercises, because they were so severe. Yeah,
exactly. Yeah.
And how does your a relationship with Bodhananda change then for you to become an official part of the Ramtha School of Enlightenment?
So, I would take the classes mostly with my dad, but then at some point I took a class just with Bodhananda alone, or somehow I ended up at his house alone. I think there was a time where I brought him like a Christmas present, or I don't remember how I ended up there on my own, but I was there. And one of the things that we often did, like after the classes, was we'd just sit around and like stare at each other. You were so wiped out. I mean, you were in a place of like exhaustion. And, we'd just sit and sometimes stare at each other. And one of the things that would happen is, like, I don't know if you've ever done this, but when you look at someone's face like long enough, sometimes their face starts to change. Like it literally like morphs into something else. And I'm sure there's a physiological reason for that. And your brain just can't hold that one image for too long. But so that was one of the things we did. And it was also like a way of connecting, like it's very sort of intimate, and it's a connection, that you feel. And so it was kind of like about feeling and letting yourself feel whatever you felt in that moment. And, ideally you were in this sort of euphoric state from like this exertion you had done. So it was kind of like a way of continuing that. And it all sounds very weird now in retrospect, to be honest. But at the time, it made perfect sense. And so on one of those occasions, Bodhananda and I had been staring at each other for probably an hour or more, who knows how long, very long. And, throughout that, he would sort of periodically say things like, he'd be like, yeah, feel that, or you keep going with that, like as if he could see what was going on with you, as if he could see what you're feeling. And for some reason, seemed accurate. It seemed like he was seeing what was going on with me. And at some point, he just sort of came over to me. And I think what he thought was happening was different than what I thought was happening, because I think he just came over to me and started kissing me. And at the time, I was really sort of taken aback, and I was like, what is going on? But I was also kind of like in this trance state, where I was kind of like out of it. And, so much of what he said was like, oh, go with it, let it happen, And so that was kind of what happened for me. I was just like, all right, I'm going with it. Like, what the heck is this? Like, it seemed weird, but that's what happened. And then from there, we just sort of became a couple, essentially. And, I was really young and had not had very many positive relationships, and didn't really know how to be in a relationship at all. And so this teacher role that he had kind of took over our relationship as well. And all of which obviously in retrospect seems so wrong and detrimental. But so from there, we would spend a lot of time together, and I felt like I was learning from him, about just how to be more happy, essentially, because I hadn't been very happy. I was very lost, and nothing I was doing was really helping. I thought, I'd come to New York to try and make things better, and to some degree it did, but I was left with this emptiness and sort of like no direction. I wasn't happy with how things were going in school, and I was very just something felt like it was missing, and this filled that hole, I think. And so within a few months, Bodhananda said that he was going to be moving to Washington. He'd been in New York for years, and the Ramtha school was in Washington, and he would travel back and forth for the events that they had, but he decided that he was going to move there. And so then it was like, okay, well, what about us, kind of thing. And I just remember this one evening where he basically took me through this progression of like, well, what do you want? And I was like, well, I just want to be happy. And he's like, well, what would make you happy? Well, I want to, I'm not happy with school. So the best thing to do would be just to drop out of school, be done with it. That would make me happy. Okay. And then what do you want to do? Like, I'm leaving. What do you want to do? Well, I want to go with you. That just all seemed to make perfect sense. But it was kind of this like guided progression that happened in the conversation with him. And, and then as well, like, well, what would that mean? How would you tell your dad? And, are you afraid that he's not going to approve? And I was like, well, I don't care. I don't give a shit. Like what anybody thinks, I'm going to do whatever the hell I want, like if I want it, I'm doing it.
Yeah. And when my father tells me that I'm not dropping out of school, well, then I'm dropping out of school. And if my father tells me I'm not leaving, well, I'm already on the plane.
Exactly. Yes. Kind of goes hand in hand with that. Like if you tell me I can't do it, I'm doing it. And yeah. it ended up happening and how I ended up moving. And my dad, in that process became keenly aware of something being wrong, which I'm sure he told you. And then started to sort of like spin out and become very like opposed, and which then at that point seemed out of character. After all the thing, the ways that he had changed, that then seemed out of character. And, from Bodhananda's guidance, he would put it like, well, my dad is just, trying to be controlling, or, he was very much sort of guiding me in how to perceive what was going on.
It's interesting that Bodhananda's approach to your decision making was allowing you to arrive at those decisions on your own. Mm-hmm. And so all the accountability lands and stays with you. But of course, when he says, when you say, well, I want to come with you, even though it might not be the right thing for you to do, because of your age or your education and stability and your father and your relationship and all of these things, because of all of those things, he doesn't say no, mm-hmm. but he's let you arrive at that decision on your own. So he's not going to oppose any of the decisions you arrive at. Mm-hmm. So you might be a bit nervous, maybe suggesting that you go with him because it might not necessarily be the right thing to do, or that he might even reject you and say, of course you can't come with me. Don't say things like that. But he mm-hmm. lets you arrive at those things on your own and then doesn't oppose them when you say them out loud.
Right. And it's so interesting. That's such a good observation, because that is very much the key to it being effective, right? Is that you think you're making your own choice. I always thought I'm making these choices. These are my decisions. And therefore I stuck to my guns with them. It was like, no, this is what I want. And this is what I'm doing. And I never for one second thought, oh, I had been guided here. I've been directed here. And, one thing I wanted to say too about sort of what you talked about before, about whether Bodhananda's, intentions were good, or whether his, what his intentions were. I think one of the things that this way of thinking that he kind of introduced, which was very probing and I don't even know what to say, analytical isn't the right word, but sort of there was a lot of back and forth that went on in your head, over things like, well, is this the right thing? Is this why is this seem wrong to me? Why am I questioning this? Those kinds of things. And what you learn to do is you learn to justify. And so in retrospect, I think that's what he did. I think that he might have thought, oh, this isn't right. Maybe this isn't, maybe I shouldn't be doing this with a 16-year-old, he was 42. Maybe I think he did have those doubts, but he talked himself out of them. He found a way of justifying whatever he was doing by it being like for good, or, he was following some feeling that he felt was right. And I think that's so, I think that's really, it's partly how he justified what he did. And I think it tells a lot about what that process was about, like how that worked. And that's what I took on myself. I took that on as well, that way of thinking.
It feels like it has elements of what I've seen a lot in sort of true crime documentaries or podcasts around coerced confession, and how if somebody doesn't necessarily get the answer that they think is correct, they will ask it in different ways or give other small bits of information to guide the person into arriving at the answer that the person given the questions thinks is the correct answer all along. And it kind of feels like it has the same sort of process.
Yeah. And what's really interesting about that is that what happens is, as if you're the one being questioned, you feel like they're looking for an answer. This is not happening consciously, you're feeling there, but you somehow know that they're trying to get at something. They're trying to get at something that you're not quite getting. And then through this process, when you finally do arrive at it, you feel elated, you feel like, oh, finally I got it, and that relief and feeling of sort of, relief is then interpreted as, oh, that's how you know you're right. That's how you know you hit the nail on the head. That's how you know this is correct. But it has nothing to do with whether what you arrived at is correct or not. It has to do with the fact that you were trying to please this person. You were trying to, find the right answer. It's like when you get the answer to something you can't really remember, and all of a sudden you get it, you're like, oh yeah, I got it,
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. It's also a way to please yourself as well, because you talked about, endorphins being released and things. And when you arrive, it's like in school, I would remember a teacher would ask a question, and if I knew the answer, my hand would be like as far up above my head as I could get it. And I would be like straining to answer the question, because it would be like, or I'd shout it out and get into trouble anyway, because then I'd be like, yes, I've said it. I know I'm right. And I've said it. And now everyone knows that I'm right as well. And it's that same sort of like, you're not just pleasing the person that's asked the question and wants to hear you give the correct answer. You're also pleasing yourself. And then there's that internal reward system, because you know that you're right. And and maybe that's kind of an element of the school system that we have that encourages that, competitiveness and eagerness to provide that information. But it was just interesting to draw those parallels between sort of this process that was happening and things like coerced confessions, where it's the same sort of thing, and there's the reward system in that, where, people, when they give the answers, are praised and, oh, thank you. Yes, that's right. Yes, that's the right answer. Oh, you're doing so well. And who doesn't want to be told that they're doing a good job?
Right, because I forget, is it negative or positive reinforcement, where you're taken out of an uncomfortable situation, right? You're in an uncomfortable situation, being questioned and, drilled essentially. And then giving that answer relieves that tension and relieves that pressure and the discomfort.
Okay, yep, I'll leave you alone now. I won't ask you that question anymore.
So it's a learned response. You learn to find those ways that give you that relief,
Mm-hmm. And interesting that you mentioned as well that you'd seen this change in your father, where he seemed a more collected, seemed to be more rational, or having less intense responses to certain things. But when he finds out about your relationship with Bodhinander, and things start to kind of make sense to him, and he starts to put the pieces together, he almost has this snapping moment, where we talk about kind of the snap, or the rose-tinted glasses come off, or the veil is lifted, and there's loads of different ways that people have explained having this situation. But he almost talks as if he has this kind of fight, flight, freeze, or the new fourth thing that people have introduced, and I can't think of what it is off the top of my head, where he realizes that he has to try and protect you at all costs, and this strange new way of working through things with this mental process is not something that he can use to justify the situation that you have found yourself in with Bodhinander at that point.
Yeah, exactly. And that was at that point then out of character from where he was before, because it seemed like an about turn, from this person that he was before.
And what's your reaction to that? Are you kind of thinking, Dad, remember your training, what you've been working on? Or are you kind of like, oh my goodness, he is acting really intense, something must be wrong?
Well, I mean, part of my reaction was naive. I thought, why is he reacting like this? Like, what could possibly be wrong? Why is he like, this seems so bizarre to me. Completely naively, because when you look back, it's like, oh my God, of course he had that reaction. Of course he had a normal human father's reaction. Thank goodness, right? So part of me was just naively believing that, everything would be fine. Everything, because I'd finally figured out what I wanted. Everybody had to go along with it and accept it, and they should be happy for me because I finally arrived at that.
And when I was chatting with your dad, it was really interesting at this point, because he kind of just said, yeah, so I found out about the relationship, and I knew that Alexandra wanted to leave, and so she dropped out of school and she left. And I was kind of thinking to myself, surely that can't be what happened. And I was thinking, did you get in touch with law enforcement? He's like, oh yeah, of course, yeah, I was in touch with the FBI. And I was like, oh right, okay. So he kind of played it down, like he found out and was kind of like, okay, then she's moving to Yelm. But then he was kind of like, no, of course I had a reaction that involved him kind of doing research around the age of consent and getting in touch with law enforcement and trying to work out a way to stop you from being able to leave.
Yeah.
So I know I keep dipping into your father's story, and I want to try and make sure that we get all of the kind of perspective from your experience. So what you pack, what kind of things do you pack to take with you, and how long does it take from your decision to leave to you actually getting on the plane, and what does that conversation with your father look like, where you're like, no, and I am definitely actually going, like I'm leaving at this time on this day?
Right. So it all happened very fast. I would say within about a month or two was the time from making that decision and then actually leaving. I believe we left on, I think it was February 29th. I think it was a leap year, or it was the 28th or the 29th. Anyway, in 92. So it would be easy to look up, but I don't know right now. But I know it was the end of February. And I had probably made that decision right at the beginning of the year or something like that. And so it all happened very quickly. I packed just the bare essentials. I was a teenager. I didn't have a whole lot. So I just packed what I needed. And I think I wanted to take my bike with me, but I don't think I ended up doing that. I don't remember. But ultimately, I think I had like 2 boxes of things, and that was it. And I remember distinctly when we were on the plane finally. And, to be fair, my dad did try a lot. Like he tried to get everybody I knew to talk to me, all of my friends, all of, our family friends, all of my family. I mean, everybody tried to dissuade me from this, and just they couldn't get through. There was no getting through to me. And on the contrary, I turned their concern into that they didn't accept me and they didn't love me and they didn't, understand me. So, he definitely tried to do everything he could to get me not to go. I mean, my mom even came over from Germany and she tried, but my mom's sort of take is much more like live and let live. So if she wants to go, let her go and learn. And I remember them telling me, you're going to regret this. You're going to regret this. We don't want you to regret this. If we don't try and talk you out of it, we wouldn't be doing our job as parents. And I just sort of assured them, I was like, there's no way, I'm not going to regret this. I know what I'm doing. And so they definitely tried. But I remember being on the plane when we finally left. And I don't even know, this is how naive I was. I wasn't even thinking about, I knew that when we got there, we'd be staying with Bodananda's friends. But I didn't know what I would do for work or anything like that. I didn't even have any concept of that. I'd just gotten out of school, And I realized at some point that I had, I think it was like $17 in my pocket. And I was like, okay. I'm going somewhere with $17 in my pocket, and that's it. And I didn't have a bank account at that time. I mean, I'm sure I did, but I didn't have any control over it. And it was like, I don't know, there was this really naive sort of process in me where I just was like, okay, I'm doing this, and whatever happens, happens.
Live and let live.
Yeah.
So,
and I'm adventurous too, it was like an adventure.
Yeah, and just kind of hoping that somebody will kind of give you the meals and things that you need until you find a way to add to your, your limited money at that point.
Honestly, it's kind of a testament to how I was raised, that I was, I always felt like everything will work out. I know everything will work out. It's okay. No matter what happens, everything will be okay. And to some degree, that's a little bit of the harm too. And a lot of the harm actually that came out of this, because that confidence and trust that I had in myself and the world was pretty well shattered when I realized, I was wrong. And so it was, I had some otherworldly confidence, to do the things that I did and just be totally fine with it. And misguided, of course, but it also kind of then really put a check on like, oh, well, maybe I don't know what I'm doing. Maybe, so.
And when you arrive in Washington, what is that like for you? Have you been there before? Was it what you expected? Do you go to the school straight away, or do you kind of stay with Bodhananda's friends before you're introduced to Jay-Z night? What does that whole process look like?
Yeah, so I mean, first of all, I was your typical East Coaster and thought Washington was Washington, D.C. So no, I'd never been to Washington State.
So was it like, did you have like raincoats and things with you?
Oh, no, I didn't have, I'm sure I had like sweaters, but I didn't have the right kind of clothes for that weather at all. I had to get like, rubber boots and raincoats and stuff. For sure was an adjustment. But the thing that I remember very distinctly is everyone came to pick us up from the airport in Seattle. And so I think there were at least probably 5 people that came to pick us up. And we were at the gate. This was when you could still go to the gate to pick people up back in the day. And so they all, waited for us as we got off the plane and came out the gate. And how there's always like benches and seating areas there. I just remember the welcome we got. It was the true textbook love bombing. I mean, classic, because we must have stood there for an hour or 2, hugging, saying hello, just sitting there, giggling, laughing. It was like, I'm sure anybody who saw us was like, these people are weird. We just sit there staring at each other, like laughing, giggling, hugging. I mean, it was the weirdest in retrospect thing, but it was your classic love bombing, where it was just like, and Bodhananda was like, oh, didn't I tell you she's so sweet? And, you can tell she's so special and all these things,
Wow. And that reaction from him then leads me to assume that he'd been in contact with these people about you before you got there. So maybe they were aware of the contentions between you and your family and your loved ones before you went over there. And even if they weren't, for you to come from a place of people kind of not accepting you, feeling like you're being judged, feeling like people don't appreciate or respect your decisions or trust you to make the right decisions for yourself, to then go to this place where you are accepted with unconditionally, I say again in air quotes, you're accepted unconditionally by this group who immediately love you and accept you and won't judge you and but then for Bodhananda to be like, didn't I tell you she was amazing? That maybe there was the opportunity beforehand for him to say, her family and friends don't approve of her coming with me. So that may have even ramped up the level of, wow, yes, you're with us and we're going to take such great care of you.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I don't know how much of that happened, but it was definitely, the way that we did things, it was like the way that everybody interacted. It was this very weird culty, in retrospect, like classic cult behavior.
It must have felt incredible for you at that point to feel like you'd found a place where you belong and you're accepted, though.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And I mean, that is so true, feeling like, because it's also it's very emotionally based, it's just like, oh my God, I feel so good. Like you're making me feel so good and accepted and loved and all those things. And like you said, like the contrast from that to where I had come from was, it's overwhelming, and it's kind of, it's nice. Nothing else I can say about it. It felt good.
So where do you go from there? Once you leave the airport, you've started your new life.
Mm-hmm. So we lived with two friends that were two of Bodananda's friends that let us stay in their place. They had, I think, a 3-bedroom, like double wide mobile home. And we were able to stay there. The daily life was kind of like, we would do communal things, like we would make dinners together, and we'd have the classes. Bodananda was teaching the classes where everybody was a part of that. So we'd have those like 3 times a week, or sometimes every day. That it became more and more frequent. And they had already all been to the school, so they had their sort of like daily routine of like disciplines and things that they would do, like quote meditations, even though we didn't call them meditations, we would call them focusing. But so I was kind of like aware that was happening, but not exactly participating in that.
How long was it before you became involved in those practices?
So we came in end of February, and the plan was for me to go to my first event. I think it was in April. But then what happened was that event was canceled, and it was because Jay-Z Knight was going through a divorce. And so it was interfering with the scheduling. And so she canceled that event. So then the next time I would have had the chance to join was in the fall. And so I made that plan that I was going to join in the fall. And, but then when I signed up for it, I ended up getting a letter. I think I paid with a money order. It was returned to me. And they said, when I called, I was like, wait, what do you mean I can't attend? I don't understand. And when I called, they said, well, look, honey, there's no way you're going to come and go to this school as long as you're not 18. Your dad called us, and he will call the FBI on us if we let you attend. So yeah, just not going to happen unless you have your dad's written permission or you're 18.
Right.
And it kind of became my mission to convince my dad to basically give me that permission or else. And I pretty much kind of tried to blackmail him and say, like, well, if you don't give me this permission, I'll never talk to you again. And, it had become very strained at that point between us because, as I'm sure he told you about, they had tried to do a deprogramming. And that was something that really blindsided me because it was kind of, totally like an intervention that was not, I didn't agree to. And I felt like I was kidnapped into, to doing it. And I was literally held at the house, like physically, I tried to leave and my dad ran after me and carried me back. And, they had people, they locked the doors, didn't let me out. And people were like, circling the house to make sure I didn't climb out a window, which I tried.
It was very intense when we spoke about that segment, and I just was thinking about it then because you talked about Jay-Z Knight going through a divorce, and I was thinking, why is that significant? Oh, because the guy that came to talk to you was the same person that spoke to Jay-Z Knight's former husband when he finally distanced himself from her.
That's right. Yeah, that was Joe Zimhart, I think, right?
Yes. Yeah. So the deprogramming that was attempted, that happened before you'd actually enrolled officially in the school itself.
Yes. So I came to Washington in February of 92, then returned to New York that summer. And during that summer is when the deprogramming happened. So I had not been able to join in April because that event was canceled. So I still wasn't going to the school, but so I came back in the summer, and that's when they tried to do the deprogramming, which I think backfired and failed because I just felt deeply betrayed, by not just the methods of like trying to hold me there and like against my will. It was everything that it really backfired. So after that, my relationship with my dad was really strained.
So he explained that they'd managed to convince you to come back because he asked you to be part of a father-daughter photo shoot.
Yes.
And so he said that he'd tried a few other things to get you to come home.
Oh, I don't even remember that.
But none of it worked until he said, I need your help with a father-daughter photo shoot, and you're the only person that can help me with that. So you're kind of like doing him a favor almost by coming home and agreeing to be in the shoot with him. And he went on to say that they really went to town by, setting up the actual shoot and getting the photographer and kind of having all the lights set up and making it look really like it was what he said it would be.
Yeah, it's funny because I don't remember us actually going through with it. I don't remember that, but yes, it's right. That was the final thing. I guess there might have been other things that I don't remember that he suggested why I should come back, but I didn't bite on those. But one of the other reasons why I did bite on this one was because it meant money. It meant I was going to get some money. And I desperately needed that. So, yeah. And I what I remember was that I don't think that photo shoot ever really materialized. And that's what started getting me kind of suspicious and then wanting to go back. And I think that's when my dad started to be like, no, we need to have this deprogramming now because she may be going back. And so the deprogramming happened like kind of under this cloud where I was already getting like kind of suspicious of like, wait, why is this not happening like you said it would? I've been there for weeks, I think. And it wasn't coming together, which didn't make sense.
And when it doesn't happen, and you said that your relationship with your father became even more strained at that point, do you feel like back in Washington there was an attempt to drive a wedge between you and your father at this point because he's making it difficult for you to follow your chosen path? Or is it you independently moving away from your father at that point?
I think it was a combination of the two. So, my response to the way my dad handled it was, I would say, pretty well in keeping with my personality in that I rebelled and also kind of, I think the thing that my parents didn't fully recognize at that time was that like what I was getting from this group of friends was acceptance and recognition of me as an individual and a person who had genuine wants and needs and desires. And my parents didn't recognize me as that. They saw me more as like, we tell you what you need to do. And, it was like it was a transition moment in my life where I was growing up and wanted to be seen as an individual. And I don't think they had caught up with that at that point. And so I felt that their response to me was, they had never been authoritarian before. My dad a little bit, but never usually like extreme. but all of a sudden, that's kind of the tack they took. It's like, no, we say you can't do this, so you can't do this. And I was like, oh, that doesn't, no, that I don't listen to that kind of garbage. Like, no, I mean, who do you think I am? Like, no. And so that didn't work, and it backfired because I just took it like they didn't understand me. And so it was easy to run to the arms of my other friends, like that was a no-brainer that of course I was going to prefer that setting over, a setting where I don't feel like I'm being seen and taken seriously.
And does this lead to your father then signing the permission for you to become part of Ramtha in an attempt to regain some type of reconciliation with you?
Right. So what happened was, after this deprogramming and I finally escaped and made it back to Washington, I just told my dad, I'm not ever speaking to you again. This was a betrayal and I felt horrible and, this unforgivable, and I would never speak to him again. And so that went on for a few months, I think. And then finally, my dad tried reaching out to me in different ways. And I think the final thing that what ended up happening, and where he sort of said he would consider giving me permission. So this was after the fall. At that point, I was 17 and I was learning to drive. And he basically made a deal with me and said, well, I'll tell you what, if I come out there and we go on a road trip, I'll come out there, spend a little bit of time with you, and I'd really like to take you on a road trip and we'll go places. And after that, if you still want my permission to go to the school, I will give it to you. And then that I agreed to. And plus, we were going to go on a road trip, so I was going to get a chance to drive.
Yeah. So he's probably hoping that he can talk to you, reason with you, give you some distance from Bodhananda and your new friends and the love bombing and all of that. And in return, you're kind of thinking, well, nothing's going to break my will, so I'll get to go on this road trip with you. And when I get back, I get to go to the school.
Yeah. And it was a very risky thing for my dad to agree to, because, one thing about my dad is if he says something, he will do it. So he had to know that if this didn't work, he did really have to give me permission to go, as much as he didn't want to. I know he didn't want to, but I also know that he didn't feel like he could go back on his word after he had agreed that he would do that. So, we had a really nice trip, honestly, that I remember. It was fun, not without its sort of conflict, but ultimately, overall, I think it was a really nice trip. And by the end of it, though, it was just a nice way to connect, really. And, but at the end of it, I still wanted to go. And I remember distinctly going to this bank where my dad signed the paper, and then we had it notarized there so that I could present it to the school so I could go to the events. And another thing that prompted this, or I don't know, it probably wasn't very influential, but I had sent my dad a letter saying, if you don't give me permission to go to the events, then I will never speak to you again. And I was almost 18. I was 17 and a half at that point. And so I was like, you'd be stupid to risk that. I will literally never speak to you again. And, so do the right thing and give me permission. And that's where I think my dad finally came up with that idea that we would spend some time together. And then if at the end of that, I still wanted to, he would do it. He would give me the permission. So
you're really kind of putting him in a difficult situation by giving him those ultimatums, and he was probably trying to think of all the ways possible to just remain in contact with you, and so
Yeah.
is it bullheaded? Is it that the expression where somebody's just not gonna change their decision?
Yeah, very. And I mean, like the tactics I used, it was like blackmail. I was trying to blackmail him too.
That's really interesting though, because we talked about people learning things from those that are teaching them, and perhaps you have picked up a few things yourself from being in Bodhananda's classes and around all of the people that have also been going through the School of Enlightenment.
Absolutely, yeah.
So once you finally get permission and you enroll, what does it look like? Is it like a daily thing? Are you supposed to practice things in your own time? How long is it before you meet Jay-Z Knight? Do you have to pay to enroll in the school?
Yeah. So the way it worked is that you had to go to a beginner event, and those were only held, I think, once or twice a year. So that year, then I finally went in April of 93 was when I finally went to my first event. And so, they kind of have it set up where you have to go to a beginning event. And once you've passed that beginning event, like passed, meaning attended it, then you're part of a certain group. Like we were given group names, and you have to sort of continue to fulfill certain requirements. So you have to go to your 2 required events a year to stay in that group. Otherwise, you have to start over from the beginning. And once you've done your beginners event and then a follow-up in the fall, I think was how it was set up, then you were pretty much open and able to go to all the other events that happened throughout the year that might have been like, just evening events or weekend events or, scheduled, various times and such. And, but you had to basically do those first 2 requirements. And so when I went to my first beginner event, that's when you're like introduced to the whole philosophy about the school, and also sort of like the first background of like the quantum pseudoscience that supposedly supports the whole teachings. And you learn like the basic disciplines that kind of form the cornerstone of the school, which are like these breathing techniques, and we did other kinds of exercises and disciplines that were all meant to like hone your mind and like basically hone your focus. And the idea being that everything that happens in your mind, or really everything that exists outside of you in your world, is a reflection of what came before in your mind. So if that's true, big if, then the reverse is also true. So if you develop your mind the way you want it to be, eventually your outside world will reflect that as well. And so a lot of the disciplines were based on that, where we would spend time like focusing on whatever it was that we want or didn't want, and changing our brain chemistry essentially was the idea. And that would then be reflected on that in our life.
How many people attended this first session with you?
I want to say there were like 300-400 people.
Whoa,
I don't
okay.
think, yeah, like so the hall where we had our events it held 1,000 people. And I don't remember it being full. I think it was like maybe half or a little less than half full. Yeah.
And every person is paying for this class.
Right. And the first retreat, oh gosh, I don't really fully remember, but I want to say it was like, I'm going to say the week-long retreats were close to $1,000, or maybe, I really don't remember, to be honest. But I don't think it was 1,000. Maybe it was like 450. I honestly don't remember, but it was several $100s.
So for a group that size to attend, and they do them twice a year, so that's a significant amount of income just from those 2 first initiation classes.
Yeah. I remember one time trying to calculate out like how much money she made at the events. And I just remember it was millions of dollars if you tried to add up all the people that went to the the events that year and, roughly estimate how much she was making. I just remember it was millions.
And do you meet Jay-Z Knight in person at these events, or is it very much sort of she is present, but it's not intimate?
Right. So the way it would work was that she, as Ramtha, would come out and like lecture and give lectures. And, it's very much, there isn't really any interaction. It's just that she would come out and give these teachings, basically. And that would be interspersed with us spending time practicing the disciplines. But ultimately, like during the retreats, you didn't really have a free moment. Like you would have a short break to get lunch or, get food or whatever. But it was like a constant. You were either getting lectured, for hours on end. I mean, sometimes it was up to, in the beginning, they don't start you out with these long lectures, but maybe it was 3-4 hours. But then, by the end, I remember some of our teachings would go 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 hours, just ongoing with almost no break. Like the only break would be like she would have to go to the bathroom or something like that.
Mm-hmm. Late into the night, and then starting with kind of different things at the break of dawn as well.
Yeah. And I mean, that was less common. Like the really long sessions were less common, but like 7-8 hours was not uncommon by the end. We were doing these crazy, sessions where we were also like drinking wine, and it kept going. It would just go on and on and on.
And you're staying with Bodhananda and his friends still at this point?
Yeah. Within a few months, though, I was kind of kicked out and I had to figure out what I was going to do.
No way. What is this because you and Bodhananda stopped your romantic relationship?
Yeah, so he basically broke it off and sort of said that he felt like I wasn't in it really, surprising. That's surprising.
Okay, so using that old, okay, yeah. So instead of saying it's not you, it's me,
it's like, right, it's you.
Yeah, using the work against you, like I'm more devoted than you are, and because of that we can't be together because I'm so serious about my spiritual journey, and I'm serious about my own path to realizing that I am God. And because you're not as serious as me, or because you're not as devoted as me, it's not going to work after I've brought you all the way out here.
Yeah. And it's interesting because again, like how he justified things, because he sort of like then told himself this whole story about like, well, this was just about me bringing you out here. And, there's always like looking for this deeper meaning that, this was all just happened so that you could, I could bring you here. And, like as if it's some altruistic thing, as if like, he did something, that had nothing to do with what he gained out of it, but simply he did that so that I could be there. And
now that his job is done, he doesn't need to be with you anymore.
Yeah, I think it was more likely now that we're getting to hot water because my dad sent like a restraining order and all kinds of things that, put the pressure on. Maybe he just got a little too sticky for him. I don't know. Plus, that is kind of like a manipulation tactic, right? It's like a way of testing your commitment, it was a way of like throwing me out like on my own to see if I would sink or swim. And given my personality, that I was not the kind to, leave with my tail between my legs, I was going to fight and figure it out. And so that's what I did.
And how did you manage that?
Honestly, it was really hard. I mean, I was kind of out on my own with zero tools and zero support. I didn't, feel like I could go back to my parents for help because they would just say, come back home. And I didn't want to do that. And so I was kind of just left to my own devices, and I ended up moving around a lot, like renting rooms here and there and just doing odd jobs. It was really, really difficult. Yeah, some of the worst time I can remember, but.
And when you're involved with the school at this level, is there like a recruitment or fundraising aspect that is put onto you? Are you expected to go out and encourage others to join? Are you expected to go out and raise money, or is it just through paying for the courses that is how the money is made for the school to continue?
Right. So we did not have an element of recruitment, not officially. There was always this sort of underlying idea that if you were being the teachings, you would inspire other people to come and be curious about what it is that, you're doing. That is kind of like what happened with me in Bodhananda. I was inspired by his sort of confidence and charisma and all of that. And he said, well, that's from the school. So naturally, I want that. So I'm going to want to go there and figure out and find out what it is and do it myself so I can have that. And so that really is sort of like the underlying and subtle way in which we weren't officially like told to go out and find other people. In fact, like on the surface, that was discouraged because, the idea is that people need to want to do this for themselves. So you weren't supposed to convince people that they should come or anything like that, which again is like a very clever way of making it seem like it's more benign than it is. Like, well, you're not being forced. You want to, you have to do this because you want to. And, but like kind of the same way that Bodhananda guided me into things that I supposedly wanted to do, it's like, there's all this, when you create this thing that's secret and, secret knowledge, of course people want that. Of course they want to find out what that is.
At one point during my discussion with your father, he mentioned that he was not in contact with you whatsoever, and you were still in contact with your mum. So he would phone her to find out if you were okay, and at least that way he knew that she'd actually heard your voice, and even though he couldn't judge for himself what you sounded like on the other end of the phone, at least he knew from your mum that you were alive and you were somewhat okay. He wondered whether his relationship with you was being thwarted from the inside because he felt like everything he tried wasn't working in terms of regaining some level of contact with you. And one thing that he mentioned, that he said he's never asked you this, and he said, you'll have to ask Alexandra because I'm not sure, but he wondered if they were positioning it to you that his intent and his love for you was not a fatherly love, and it was different to a fatherly love, and that's how they were managing to keep you from regaining contact with him.
I mean, certainly they made it, they sort of twisted it in the sense that his actions were selfish, that they had nothing to do with what I wanted or recognizing me as a person or anything like that. And that he, part of the teachings was that, as you change and you become a new person, the people in your life aren't going to be able to cope with that because they only know you as the old person. And so, they can't handle you as this new person. And that's kind of a little bit of how it was turned, that somehow, he's just trying to hold me back to be that person that I used to be. Whereas I'm really developing into this new being that I now, am, and he's trying to thwart that basically. I think that was probably the extent of it. I don't think that there was anything like really like nefarious in that way, other than sort of like turning the way he his concern from just a perfectly normal concern into like, oh, he's trying to hold you back and, control you essentially.
From his position and having this distance from you and this no contact, I imagine every possible scenario must have gone through his mind, and he must have had so much time to try and figure out exactly what you were being told and what was being said to you to make you maintain this level of no contact with him. And I wonder if that is perhaps why he thought that this narrative may have existed, because of course to insinuate that he is abusive in some way or wants to abuse his relationship with you is possibly the worst thing that a parent can do to their child. So he must have thought, maybe, I'm just making assumptions here, and I don't know if Bob will listen back to this, but perhaps he thought, well, the only thing that they must have convinced her of is that I want to harm her, and that's why I can't seem to regain some contact with my daughter. But he talked about sending you a Father's Day card, and that is what actually kind of started the process of you picking up communication again.
Right. So so from the time when I was about 18, when he finally did give me that permission, and I went to my first events and started going there, until I believe we didn't speak for 3 years. So from the time I was like 18 to 21. And throughout that time, he would try to reach out. He would send me cards. He would call, but I didn't return his calls. And I think I even at some point changed my number so he didn't have it. And, basically I ignored him. And eventually, but yet he sent a card every holiday, every birthday, he always sent something. And finally, he sent me this Father's Day card. He is sending me a Father's Day card, sending him a Father's Day card, which was funny. And in that card, he had a picture. It had a picture of me on the phone, where it was a picture from when I was a kid, where I was standing in a phone booth holding the receiver, like I was on a call. And it was a cute little photo of me. And I think that's all it was. And he said, call me.
He said he taped a nickel inside the card or something like that.
That's what it was. Yes, he gave me the money to call him. Like it was like, whatever it cost, maybe it was a nickel to make a phone call. Right. I didn't even remember that, but that sounds right. And, it was cute. And at that point, I kind of had gotten over a lot of the anger that I felt. And I kind of, I think I just, my not speaking to him was in a way, my way of establishing some control over the situation where I felt I had no control, whether it was because of the experience that we had with the deprogramming or just the underlying experience of not having control over my life because of this environment I was in. And so it was misguided and misplaced on my dad. I think there was a combination of the two, but it gave me a way to feel like I was affecting something in my life and I was asserting myself and in control. And by the time I got that card, I kind of felt less of a need for that. I think I felt more comfortable and confident in my life and what I was doing. And I'd become, a little more self-sufficient. And the other deciding thing at the time was I had a boyfriend who he had lost his dad, like in a really tragic car accident. And when he heard that I don't speak to my dad, he was like, "Are you crazy? Like I would give anything to speak to my dad, and you're not talking to him by choice." And he just kind of like expressed to me how painful that was for him not to be able to speak to his dad and see him anymore and have that relationship, and that he thought I was nuts for not taking advantage of, that connection when I have it. And I still remember one time, I think this was during the time that my dad was visiting and we went on that road trip, and we had like a dinner with everyone, like all my friends, and my dad was there too. And it was very tense and very uncomfortable. And my dad, I think, said something that was critical, or, raised some issue that kind of made things very uncomfortable and tense. And after my dad left, everybody was sitting around and we were talking about it. And they were asking me, like, what is it you're afraid of? What are you afraid of? Kind of like, why don't you tell your dad off, basically, kind of thing. Like, why aren't you standing up for yourself and telling him that this is what you want? Or I don't, something along those lines. And I remember, thinking about it and again, trying to get to the root of what is it? Why am I afraid? And I remember what came to me was, I'm afraid that he's going to die. I'm afraid that he's going to die and I'm not going to figure this out with him before he dies. Like, that was my worst fear in that moment, was that I would miss a chance to make this right. Mm-hmm. And when I said, I'm afraid he's going to die, that was not the answer they expected at all. That was not what they thought. And as I remember, like, it kind of wasn't accepted. Like, it was like, no, that's not it. But I realized it. I realized, like, no. And what that told me was, like, I must know on some level that this is wrong. And I must know that I'm kind of like, I'm taking a really huge risk here, because what if he died and I didn't make up with him before he did? Then I wouldn't have that chance. And so even though this was years later when I got the Father's Day card, that in combination with, what my boyfriend had told me about missing his dad, and all of that just sort of was like a perfect storm where I was like, okay, you know what? I'm going to call him. And so I called him, and it was a little awkward and strained at first and didn't know what to talk about. And I think I was doing some kind of multi-level marketing business at the time. And he was definitely critical of that. Like, he questioned it and why I was into it, and what was so special about these products I was selling, and which I didn't like, because I didn't like that I was being questioned. But somehow we kind of reestablished contact through that.
I wonder if him sending you the card with the money, but not trying to contact you through the phone and leaving that decision with you, even though you've said that you needed control over your own decision making and power over your own decisions, but kind of felt less of a need for that at the time the card came. I wonder if maybe that was even the same thing. He's basically, he's given you the olive branch, but he's not tracking down your new number, or, he talked about camping out in the woods near where you were living at some point and just saying, like, I'm here if you, I just want to show you that I can be in the area and so.
Did that? I don't remember that.
Yeah, I wonder if you'll listen to his episode and if there'll be parts of it that and things that happened that you were never aware of. But yeah, he talked about camping out near where you were living, like, just so he could see you and know that you were okay. Year
he came up for like a surprise visit at Christmas, and I think this was before we were talking. And he drove up and just wanted to spend Christmas together. And I remember I told him no. We did go out for like coffee or something. We had a meal together, but then I just told him no, I didn't want to see him. And basically, I think it was like Christmas Eve. And I was like, nope, sorry. I think I might have said, well, you can come and spend Christmas with us, with all of us. And he was probably said, no, I'm not going to do that. I'd like to spend it with you. Let's go somewhere or something. And I said, no, I'm not doing that. So that was the end of that. But he was really upset. I remember he was so hurt and upset, I remember. And I did feel bad, but not bad enough, I guess. I think I was still in the process of punishing him. And so it was still a little while before, probably another year before we ended up speaking.
But again, with that card and that being the olive branch, the power for you to make that decision to actually call him it still lies with you at that point. So that could have, maybe that was possibly the best thing that he did in terms of reestablishing communication, because he's not putting, well, maybe there's a certain level of pressure because he's reminding you that it's Father's Day and you're not talking to him, and, you know, he misses you and he's your father, and you know, there's certain customs that come with Mother's Day and Father's Day and all of these things. But again, he's not trying to find out your number and call you repeatedly. He is leaving that decision to call with you. So
definitely. Yes.
Not only.
Right. I mean, that was a very smart, and, you know, I mean, it definitely, I think you're right. It was it was a way for me to I was taking control and deciding to reach out to him. And I think that was probably why it was so effective too.
And maybe the Father's Day card made you realize that you have a father and actually maybe you do miss him a little bit.
Absolutely. Yeah. And, you know, I know that at the time, my friends tried to interpret this as though he was trying to guilt trip me and all these things, which I did feel some of that, you know, in his repeated attempts to reach out to me, that some of it felt like a guilt trip, even though I know it wasn't. But that's how they sort of tried to interpret it. And I just remember sort of feeling like, no, this isn't like that. Like, this was more like, you know, it was kind of humorous too. Like, he sent me a nickel so I could call him with this photo of me as a little kid on the, you know, tiny little kid in this big phone booth with a little, you know, with the receiver I could barely reach. And it was very cute.
And the interaction with your friends, where you arrive at the understanding of why you are worried about certain things with your father, and that, you know, he will pass away one day, and perhaps that will happen before you get the chance at reconciliation, and your friends are kind of saying, no, that's not the right answer. Again, it's that confession process that we were talking about earlier, but this time you didn't care if they thought that wasn't the right answer, because something inside you made you realize that you'd arrived at some sort of truth that felt real to you at that point.
Yeah, exactly. And you know, it's funny because, like, looking back, there are a few moments like that I feel like were so critical and crucial in, like, making, you know, all kind of building up to cause the final sort of, you know, the final breakdown, or the, you know, how it all fell apart. But there are those moments that are so, like, they're so dramatic almost, you know, in how they affect you, and like a realization that made me sort of feel like that supported the doubts that I had. You know, somewhere in me there were always doubts, but we were told, you know, you weren't supposed to doubt, and that if you were doubting anything, that was something, a fault in you, and so you had to fix that and get rid of it.
Mm-hmm.
But then there were these moments where things like that would happen, and it was like all of a sudden I felt my own, like you said, you know, you feel like something resonates that is true, and it has nothing to do with what you're being told. It's like, it's your gut essentially.
And we always say that if you get those feelings and those seeds of doubt, that it's okay to nurture them. It's okay to mull them over in your mind a little bit, and to see where that thought might take you, and to elaborate a little bit more on the idea of doubt, instead of pushing it away because it's something you've been taught or told is wrong to do. And we always try to encourage that kind of small step into critical thinking when somebody starts to experience those things, if they are on their way out of their own high demand control groups. So that's a very, very good point that you've raised there about kind of following your gut and understanding that those instincts are natural and they exist for a reason.
Right. And, you know, that part is so contrary to that that sort of mental gymnastics that you do to justify all of the stuff that's going on. It's so opposite. And that's kind of like why I pointed out too, like how I think Bodhananda justified things to himself. the same way you need to cultivate that intuition and the gut knowledge and knowing, being able to distinguish what is your gut and what is, worry, or what is just, influence or whatever. Like, you have to cultivate that. But part of this mental, stuff that we did in trying to justify and question and analyze and probe was totally the opposite, and like denied that part completely. And so that was what we were cultivating, was that mental process versus actually, like you said, the critical thinking and the sort of intuition and thoughts that if you carry them further might actually show you something.
And you mentioned that during your introduction into the school, there were things like reduced meal times where you would rush to eat to get back to the sessions, and maybe sort of a lack of a good night's sleep because the sessions ran so long and you were up early hours to start the next day. And these are just the introduction sessions. So is that kind of, and you were part of the Ramtha School of Enlightenment for 10 years. Mm-hmm. So is this something you came accustomed to as time went on? Is that how the process worked for all of the sessions that you were involved in terms of the high demand of the environment?
Yeah, very much so. And it really became like, the more the further I got into it and the more sort of advanced I became, the more we had those kinds of sessions, like where, there were often times where we would go and do like the disciplines that we would do, and we would be, instructed to do it, but we didn't know how long it would go. So we were never told, you're going to do this for an hour or you're going to do this for 2 hours. We just had to keep going. That was part of the training, was to become so absorbed and so, fight that urge to like, jump out of your seat or, whatever it may be, but rather just keep going, because the whole philosophy was that if you are doing that, you're basically choosing that new neuro pathway. You're choosing and reinforcing this dream that you have, or whatever it may be that you're focusing on, over your body's needs, or your, we called it like your monkey mind, like your, the chatter that's going on in your head. You had to shut all that out and focus like single pointedly on the thing that you wanted. And that was how you were supposedly going to achieve those things. And so if a session went on for 5, 6, 7, 8 hours, we were just expected to stick with it and, deal with all the stuff that came up and all of the, resistance and whatever it may be, and ultimately keep redirecting ourselves back to this focus, whatever it may be. Mm-hmm. And that any kind of resistance or doubt or questions you have, it was your job to eliminate those and just choose something else. And so it's like part of what it makes it so insidious and effective, because you are doing that to yourself. Nobody is telling you to do that other than the directions, like here's, this is what we're doing, but nobody is really forcing you to sit there and do that. It's what you're doing to yourself in your own head.
I imagine having one thing to focus on and not being able to have the space to think or focus on anything else, first of all, sounds absolutely exhausting. Second of all, it's not a way that people can typically function, I imagine, because even like I think about me with my kids, I think about, what they need for breakfast and what they need to get dressed. And then like, so even if I just focus on the kids and everything that they need, you could break that down into specific things that they need that you need to focus on. But then also there's other things like the washing up and going to get petrol for the car and, going to see that friend that's having a really difficult time. So I don't feel like having one thing to focus on is feasible.
No.
if you have other responsibilities and things you have to take care of, and lives that you are responsible for, and these things, but also if you're applying those same practices outside of these sessions. I spoke to somebody else who was practicing a similar process, but when he tried to apply it to his everyday life, he ended up having a nervous breakdown because he couldn't fulfill the practice with all of the parts of his life that played out like a typical everyday experience. So I imagine that you also are exhausted from applying the work from the sessions to everyday life, but also that you become dependent on those mechanisms, because then you don't know how to function without going through that process when it comes to, okay, so I really need to get this job, so I'm really going to focus on really doing the work so that I can bring this new opportunity into my life. And then the heartbreak that comes if you don't get that job. And again, we're back to mental gymnastics.
Oh, absolutely. And meanwhile, you're having this sort of, intense focus on holding this in your mind. Let's say, take that example of a job interview, and you're like, you have to basically imagine that you already have the job and all of this. And then you go into that job interview and you're just a weirdo. Who can do that and come across as a genuine, normal human being? At least not, I couldn't. It's like because you become kind of robotic. And definitely, I know people responded to me weirdly.
And you're part of the Ramtha School of Enlightenment for 10 years. So after a decade of being involved and given a significant portion of your life, you're about 26 at this time. Mm-hmm. So much of your life has been spent in this movement. You've moved and created your own life and a place where you live and friends and family and everything you've established over in Yelm in Washington. So what is it that makes you finally decide to walk away?
Yeah, so I finally, what was the final sort of straw was I met my ex-husband now, but at the time, we met there. And we met in, I think it was 2000. Like I fell really deeply in love, and we just, were super happy and really, felt so happy like I hadn't in I don't remember how long, and maybe ever, I don't know, but we had a really great relationship. And through that experience of sort of having something else that made me happy, and allowing myself to sort of let some of the school aspect of me go a little bit, I think it sort of opened a little crack into that doubt, and it allowed the doubt to sort of come out a little bit more, where I wasn't spending my every waking moment trying to suppress the doubts, and plus I was back in touch with my dad, and, my dad continued to try to, I don't know what's the word, like inflame or spark the, my critical thinking. And he would say things that, sometimes made a lot of sense. And it was through those little things that happened that I think allowed me to sort of become a little bit more questioning. And ultimately, the final thing was September 11th, where, everything kind of went crazy. And there was so much chaos after that happened. And the way people reacted in the cult was madness. Total madness. Like every conspiracy theory you can think of was thrown at us, like this is the end times that we've always talked about. And like, this is why you don't get on airplanes, and this is why you don't travel. And, don't listen to anything you're being told because they're just lying. And, but what happened for me was that it was like the first time that I actually did listen to the news, and I did listen to the radio, and I did like listen to what was going on. And I kind of saw how all of the stuff that we were being told in the school existed in a vacuum. So if you didn't know anything else outside of that, it was easy to accept it. But if you had some other perspectives, then it no longer made sense. And so I started to question those things based on some of the other perspectives I was seeing, like in the news and stuff. And for myself, it didn't jive anymore. Like, it just didn't make sense. Like, I don't believe what you're telling me here. It doesn't make sense. Like they told us that, that the whole, like the anthrax, when the anthrax thing happened, that, there were cans of oranges that were on the shelf that had anthrax in them because somebody had placed it there. And it was like, wait a minute, like that makes no sense whatsoever. If that were true, cans have a shelf life of like 5 to 10 years, right? I mean, they've been on the shelf for a long, long time. And, we would have heard of people dying if that were true, right? And so just that little bit of critical thinking that then told me like that doesn't make any sense was met with like total, well, you don't doubt what you're being told. You shouldn't be doubting what you're being told. And that more and more just didn't feel right to me. It felt like, no, I don't believe in that. I don't believe that you should blindly, just take our word for it. Like, we have to question it. And through that, and then my dad also, the whole September 11th thing was crazy because my dad was actually scheduled to be on one of the planes that went down.
No way.
Yeah. And he was scheduled to fly that day, and he was supposed to be on one of the planes out of Boston. And when, he called me and we found out what had happened, and he was like, because we couldn't even speak to him for most of the morning. I think there were no phones, until maybe the afternoon. We couldn't get through to anybody. And finally he called me and he said, I'm okay. I don't think I had put together in my head that he was possibly going to be in one of those planes. But that's when he told me. I knew he was supposed to fly that morning. I just didn't put together that, he was going to be in one of those planes. But when he did tell me, it was another one of those moments where I was like, oh my God, can you imagine? Like, can you imagine? I couldn't imagine. And then, and what that did was it also made me sort of feel so much empathy and compassion for the people what they had been through, what they were going through, right? People who did lose people that day. And that was like a new experience for me. I mean, like, you have to understand, like, we didn't do that in the cult. We didn't have compassion for people. We didn't put ourselves in other people's shoes. We believed that what happened to them because they basically made it happen. And so why would you feel sorry for them, or why would you feel compassion? Like, they did something that brought it upon them. And I could not accept that. It just did not jive with what I was experiencing. And I felt like, for the first time in I don't know how long, I was feeling like real pain and compassion for other people that I guess for me, it was so out of the norm that it was like extraordinarily painful. And I kind of realized that all of these other justifications were a way to avoid that pain. And I felt like that was, in a weird roundabout way, I felt that was contrary to the teachings. I felt like people weren't actually living what these teachings were that we were supposed to be feeling, living. And so I felt that I was justified in going against what most people were saying, because I felt like I was actually being more committed to these teachings, right? Like I was, so it was a little bit of like a mind trick that I played on myself, where I justified to myself it was okay to question, because I was actually doing the right thing. And, you know, even though on the surface it seemed like I was questioning the teachings, I was actually living the teachings more sincerely than anyone else, you know?
So, my dad works with a very strict vegan.
Oh yeah.
Who wears a leather belt. And my dad had this argument with this person about him wearing, he said, but you're wearing a leather belt. And he said, but you eat meat and you eat dairy. And my dad said, that's not what we're arguing here. We're talking about you being a strict vegan and condemning me for being a meat eater, but you're wearing a leather belt. So it's almost like your peers are claiming to practice something, but saying that you practice something and actually practicing something are two different things a lot of the time. And this is an example, you know, this person that my dad works with, he says, I'm a strict vegan and you shouldn't eat meat. And then my dad says, well, you know, you're not really that strict of a vegan, because look at the clothes that you wear. So that's there's so much in what you've just said as well that must have been so hard for you to, first of all, 9/11, I cannot even imagine the impact that had on civilians at the time, because we felt it over here. They sent us home from school. We had a teacher come in the classroom and say, kids, school's finished. It was like, you know, it was nowhere near home time, but, you know, they came in and they said, kids, you know, we've phoned around the parents, it's time to go home. And we were kind of all a bit like, well, that only happens on snow days. School's only ever cancelled when there's heavy snow. What's going on? And we were too young to really comprehend the severity of what had happened. But to be a civilian over there, I imagine the impact. But then to find out that your father was supposed to be on one of those planes, and then to be told that it's a conspiracy, that nobody was on the planes, or that the planes were hijacked, or that the planes were full of dummies that weren't actual people, and all of these strange beliefs that came forward. How then if you were to believe that, you would then have to believe that your father was somehow involved in one of these conspiracies, because he, as somebody that you know, you're not just talking about people whose names you've heard on the news who have never touched your life in any way. Even if you felt no compassion for those people and those families, which you said, you know, you've already said that you did, it's so easy for people to disengage or desensitize themselves from other people's lives, you know, to feel no empathy for or sympathy for people who you've never been in personal contact with. But how do you explain your father supposed to be on one of those planes and then to be told that it's a conspiracy somehow? And you know, and we're not just talking about conspiracy a way for America to infiltrate Afghanistan and Iraq for the oil. You know, if they were talking about every conceivable conspiracy, there were some really wild things that were thrown out there about what happened around 9/11, and your response to that sounds almost like your father's response to finding out about you and Bodhananda. Everybody's talking about these conspiracies, and you kind of had this snap moment where you have your fight, flight, or freeze moment where you say, hang on a minute, wait, what? How are we saying that this is not a tragedy? How are you using this to further instill fear into your followers so that they'll pay for more sessions and come back for more workshops and learn how to protect themselves more, because we're all at risk now of being pulled into this conspiracy one way or another?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And for them to say that, you know, the cans of oranges have been spiked and they're living on the shelves, and then for you to say, well, we would hear about that, and then for them to say, don't question. Right. How can you doubt or question? You know, at this point, I remember watching a Forensic Files episode where there was unpasteurized apple juice being sold on the shelves. And I think some people actually died from, and it took them ages to track it back to where and I'm sure this was in the 90s, it took them ages to track it back to the cause and where it came from. And it was a manufacturing problem in the end. And it was E. coli that was in the juice from the unpasteurized ingredients that we used. But then you've also had the Rajneesh incident at this point, where salad bars have been purposefully dosed in salmonella, which has been grown in a lab on the ranch and used to purposefully make people sick. So of course you would hear about it, because these things have happened and we've already heard about them happening. So if people were being spiked by oranges in cans, if they can trace it back in the 90s to a manufacturing plant miles away in the 90s, they can do that. The oranges,
right?
Exactly. When you hear about it. So you're right to say, hang on a minute, that doesn't make sense.
Right. And the other part of it was that supposedly the risk from anthrax was inhaling it, not ingesting it. So it was like, why? But then the question is like, why make up this bullshit? Like, why make it up? It just makes no sense, other than to show that you will believe anything, to reinforce that we can tell you whatever the hell we want and you are going to believe it because we said so. And something clicked and it just went, no, I don't buy it. And then the other part of it was that having sort of that moment, which kind of took me back to where, like, oh my gosh, my worst fear was that my dad was going to die. It felt almost like another moment where, like, oh my gosh, he might have died, but he didn't, thankfully. And it made me feel like I want to, all of a sudden, for the first time, I wanted to travel. I wanted to see my family, which I hadn't done for years, probably 5 years. I hadn't really been anywhere. And because we were discouraged from traveling, and that was dangerous and scary in the outside world and all of that. And so it really just sort of pushed me and my husband at the time to say, like, you know what, we want to get out there and we want to live. Like, life could be over any second and we want to live.
I suppose it really puts into perspective your mortality after the events of 9/11, and you realize that perhaps there is more to existing than focusing on one thing at a time and putting all of those practices from the school into place, when you could have simply boarded one of those planes that day and all of that work would have been for nothing anyway.
Right. Yeah.
Wow. Oh my goodness. Wow. And your father never mentioned that. He never mentioned that he was supposed to be on one of those planes. Wow. That's wild.
The reason he wasn't was that it was a really early flight. So I think those planes left Boston around 8 a.m. And he would have had to leave New York, where he was, at like 6 a.m. to get to his flight. And he just decided, like, he wasn't going to ask his mom to drive him to the airport at that time. Like, it was just a fluke, sort of like, I'll take the next flight. And like, what a minute little decision that changed everything, And
it speaks to your father's personality so much, because he didn't want to put his own mum out of her way by asking her to get up early and get him to the airport and stuff. So,
Well, we're not morning people. That's a family.
No, I think morning people are in cults anyway.
Yeah.
So I don't know. I that's a generic statement. I'm not a morning person myself, and with kids you have to be. So I'm begrudgingly a morning person at the moment. But So you're part of the school for 10 years. A series of events lead to you becoming somewhat disenchanted with the movement, and so you leave with your husband, but it takes another 5 years for you to identify that the Ramtha School of Enlightenment has cult-like methods of control, coercion, and practices.
Yeah, it was very interesting. that I didn't put all that together. I only, after leaving, it was a really chaotic time for me, like emotionally, but I couldn't pinpoint why. Like I never really pinpointed why. Eh, and I think, in retrospect, it was because my world fell apart. Like my whole world view fell apart. And, but I was used to just dealing with it. I was used to just dealing with whatever was going on, kind of like in constant crisis mode. And so I didn't really think much of it, and I didn't pinpoint what was going on. And I had no like education or psychoeducation on it. So I really just sort of thought, well, I did this and now I'm not doing it anymore and I'm just moving on. And it wasn't until about 5 years later, I was we had moved away from that area, still in Washington, but Eastern Washington. And I had a good friend, and she kept talking about having been in a cult. And she kept talking about, yeah, and then I got out of this cult, and yeah, we were in this cult, and then we left. And I was like, well, what was that? What made it a cult? Why would you call it a cult? And so she finally sort of explained that she was in this, hers was like a family Christian kind of cult. But when she explained the dynamics of having to follow certain rules, and if you stepped outside of that, you were considered like a sinner, or, you were questioned, and yet at the same time, you weren't allowed to question anything. And something about the way she explained the dynamics that were going on at the time in her situation made me realize, holy shit, I was in a cult. I was like, this is so familiar to me. I can so relate to what you're telling me right now. I think I was in one of those, and it was like an aha moment, and like a light bulb went on, and it made me like rethink everything, my relationship with Bodhananda, everything that we had learned, whereas I had kind of left it, a little bit in my mind, like, well, maybe they're not doing something great, but what do I care? What do I care? I'm not doing it anymore, so who cares? It's kind of like the same mentality of being in the cult, where it's like, well, they're creating their reality. Why should I care? Like, you're almost taught to like not take an interest in other people's choices and lives because, it's none of your business, or it's, their own doing. So why care? All of a sudden that like protective mechanism like fell away, and I was like questioning it and realizing that I had been in a situation where I was influenced, and I was young, and I was, pressured. And I just started questioning all of it and realized that happened to me.
Did you take that revelation to your husband and your father? And did they have sort of a reaction to you kind of putting a label on your experience?
I don't remember telling my dad, but I think I did tell my husband, or maybe I did tell my dad. Eventually I think I did. I know that early on, when we had left the cult, my dad at some point offered to me, he said, if you ever want to talk to somebody about your experiences, I know somebody who has experience with these types of groups and this and that and cults. I think he might have even said cults. And at the time I was like, well, I wasn't in a cult. Why should I do that? I don't care. I'm fine. I'm totally fine. And I wasn't fine at all, but I thought, I was just being tough. And when I had that realization and I sort of like rethought all of those things, and I think for the first time, I also sort of questioned the whole, like my age and how Bodhananda, took advantage, and which I had up until that time just not questioned and just left to be like, oh, well, it is what it is. And I did talk to a friend at the time who had been in the cult, but she was no longer in it. But I don't think she had the same realizations that I had had. And when I brought it up to her, I felt like she was justifying and she wasn't hearing what I was saying. You know, she wasn't hearing that I was saying it affected me negatively. And I remember how upset that made me. Like it made me really upset that I felt like I wasn't being acknowledged and heard. And, you know, but part of it was that I couldn't really put my finger on what was bothering me or why I was so upset. And so I couldn't really articulate like what was wrong. But it was like an internal process of sort of figuring out like why, you know, it made me realize that I had to question everything. Like I had to question everything that I thought had been me up until that point, like everything that I thought I had gained and I thought I had grown from and taken as like my own personality, and then realized like maybe it isn't. And I ended up having severe PTSD, like to the point that I couldn't make any decisions. Like I just couldn't decide. Like I couldn't decide what to eat at a restaurant because I think part of it was like I was so afraid of making the wrong choice because I felt I had failed myself with the choices I had made before. And of course, like none of that was really conscious. It was just I felt frozen and like I couldn't do anything. And that's when I sort of remembered that my dad had told me years before that he knew somebody that I might be able to speak to. And that's when I started going to therapy and seeing someone, you know, specifically about the cult experience. And it was kind of for me about like, and I'm still doing that, picking apart like what was good, what was not, you know, what do I take from it that I conclude that I'm, you know, is still a part of me and is okay. And yeah, trying to put like words to the things that bothered me about it. And I feel like I'm still doing that. I feel like I'm still figuring that out. And I feel like internally I've processed a lot, but I don't necessarily know how to articulate that other than sort of like an internal knowing, you know? Yeah, so it's still a process.
I feel that often when we have these discussions on this show and people come away from the group that they've been involved in or grown up in, that they can't quite put their finger on why it is that they are so upset and sad. And I think a lot of the time it comes down to grief. You're in mourning. You're mourning not only, you know, the 10 years of your life that you've put into this, you're mourning, you know, what you're leaving behind and what you've built and the person that you were and the person that you were before you joined, the person you were during, and all of those things. And I think because there hasn't been a physical person in your life that's passed away where you have a funeral and, you know, you go through the customs of you know, when a loved one passes away, because that hasn't happened and there's no process that goes with it, it's often hard to put your finger on what that is. But sometimes I feel like people, what they describe is that they are in mourning and they are grieving and they can't quite put their finger on what it is. So when they try to explain it to family and friends and they're not understood, it's often because they don't realize themselves that maybe that's what's happening. And I'm not saying that that's what happened with you, but when it was just the way that you said you were so sad and you couldn't quite put your finger on why it was that you were feeling that way.
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, especially, you know, to some degree, that was literally happening to me where I was feeling like I missed all these years of my life. Like for the first time, I think I was experiencing the consequences of having not finished school, not gone to college, you know, living a life of constant struggle, even though at that time, like things had gotten a little bit better because my ex-husband had gotten a really good job, but still, I felt like there was a huge gap in my knowledge, in my social skills, in, I feel like I missed the entire 90s. I mean, to this day, there are certain references I just simply don't get. And, I feel really left out, but yeah, and I realized that I felt mad about it. I was mad that I had been robbed of that time, and I remember expressing that to this friend who had been in the cult as well, and hearing the justifications of like, well, if you hadn't done that, you wouldn't be where you are now. And like, kind of like everything that you did before brought you to where you are now. It's like, no, that's not good enough. Like, I am entitled to be angry about this.
Yeah, absolutely.
Angry about this and feel that loss because it's real. There's certain things you don't get back. You just don't, you can never get those years back. You can never get that, especially for me, like that developmental time where I would have been building certain things like, certain just life experience and building things up for, for me to be able to thrive on, thrive from. I missed it. I felt almost like I stopped developing and then I picked up again. And so in some ways, I feel like developmentally, I'm 10 years younger, I mean, I think I've caught up a little bit, but for a while, I felt that way. I felt like I had missed out on something that I needed to catch up on developmentally.
And you have a daughter who is 18 now. So I suppose an interesting question for me to ask you is how you think you'd react if your daughter was to try and do the same things to you that you did to your father.
Oh my God, I would be devastated. I would go insane. I would completely, I feel that I'm somewhat thankful and grateful that she's made it to 18 without doing some of the things that I did. I mean, but that doesn't mean that couldn't still happen to her. I mean, it's, I don't feel, this is one thing that I feel like I've come out of this experience with. I don't feel you're ever safe. I don't feel, I mean, maybe that's kind of sad and scary, but I don't feel that anyone is ever safe from this sort of thing happening to them. I don't care how smart and educated or supported you think you are. Like, I feel like this can happen to anyone given the right circumstances and the right vulnerabilities, which I feel is what I experienced, and then just the right person coming in and, I think when you've had an experience like that, innately, like, this could happen to anybody. And I even know it could happen to me again. I don't feel like I am immune to it either, except that maybe my radar is a little more finely tuned. But I also know from experience that anytime I'm going through a transition or some kind of, upheaval in my life, I am extremely vulnerable. And so I guess my antenna are up for that.
That is incredible that you've just said that. We definitely try and make a point on this show when we get the opportunity to mention that the stigma that comes with air quotes the type of person that joins a cult, that there is no type of person. And your dad summed it up perfectly when he said, if you speak to the right person at the right time, you're done for. That's it. If they get you,
yeah,
and they speak to you, and if you're in, like you've just said, one of those transitional periods or a state of upheaval, or you've lost a loved one, or, there's a significant shift in your life and you're vulnerable in any way, that's it. Yeah. And the way that he said that, I was like, wow, yeah, that's exactly it. You could have all the doctorates and degrees in the world or all the experience with coercion and cults in the world. But, you've even mentioned there that you were working under some type of MLM whilst being in the school of Enlightenment. So where does it end? Where does it stop? It's just, yeah, it's definitely interesting to see your reaction to the question of what you would do if your daughter came to you and said, Mum, I'm moving across the country with a man of this age to go join the Ramtha School of Enlightenment. And you said that you'd probably just go insane. And I wonder if you feel like you'd be able to react to it the way that your father did, or if you would react to it completely differently, because I understand he tried a few things that for you at the time felt like an invasion, or a break in the trust that you had for him. But I feel like when he spoke to us, he did everything in his power that he could think to do, whether it was to ambush you or to send you the Father's Day card. He did everything in his power possible to try and get you back.
Yeah. And, I think I would do the same thing. I would do exactly the same thing. And I would do everything that I possibly could. And I would adjust the same way that he did, like, well, this isn't working. Now we got to try something else. I feel like I've done that with my daughter in different circumstances where it's like, okay, well, this parenting strategy isn't working. I think we need to try something else, because you don't know how your actions are going to be perceived by your kid and how they're going to respond. And you have to be flexible and work with it and figure it out. And I would hope, if something like that would happen with my daughter, that she would be open to listening to me. But I know from experience that the whole nature of somebody being under an influence like that is that they are not open, and that they're literally not able to function normally. And so I think it would be devastating, and I would be heartbroken. And I would never give up trying to reach her. But I know that there's certain realities to when somebody is in that state that make things impossible. And that's why I think it's so hard for the loved ones of people who are in cults and situations, these control situations, because you don't have any control and you can't do anything about it.
And that's absolutely one of the reasons why this segment has focused on your relationship with your father and his perspective on your experiences, more than focusing solely on the School of Enlightenment, because given the opportunity to speak to the two of you and compare your experiences and how you both felt and thought at those same times, I feel it's a more important message to explore with you and to give to the listeners, in case any of them are listening and have loved ones themselves involved in similar situations, and the loved ones are struggling to reach that loved one, and are kind of at a loss of what to do in order to support that loved one. And so when I first got in touch with your father and he explained the situation to me, I felt like it would be better to explore that than to focus too much on the Ramtha School of Enlightenment. But I do also feel like we've covered enough of the school to pinpoint some cult-like methods of control that are being implemented in the system to hopefully deter anyone thinking about enrolling or becoming involved, especially as you're still working today on putting yourself together and realizing who you are and the way you think and feel separate to the Ramtha School of Enlightenment, whilst also understanding that that is part of your life, and it's not something that you can detach yourself from completely, because you spent so much of your life enrolled in the school. So it's definitely been insightful to have that conversation with you and your father. So I guess the last question that I have for you before I ask you if there's anything you think we've missed today is to ask you what advice you would give to others who have experienced a high demand group themselves, but also to those who have loved ones that may be involved with high demand groups.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like similar to what we were talking about, like all the things my dad tried, it may come down to you've got to just keep trying different things and find what works. But I I think it's important to talk about what you've experienced with someone, whether it's an expert or family, friends. But primarily, I think what's important is talking about it where you can be heard and understood. So talking to other people who've been through what you've been through, where you are understood. So you don't have to, you don't feel like you have to explain yourself too much. Like there's just sort of like an understanding that people have that have been through something similar or who have experience with it and understanding of it, versus having to convince people of your experience. And that can be like re-traumatizing, because it's really important to be understood, because it's healing. It heals, and it helps to validate like what you went through that was wrong. So I would say talking to someone, also just being patient with yourself and understanding that, what happened isn't your fault.
Absolutely.
And living with the consequences is a burden and a responsibility that you have to live with and navigate. And you don't have to be perfect. You'll figure it out, and you'll sort of come to a place of peace about it eventually.
I think that's absolutely wonderful advice to give to people. Patience, don't blame yourself, talk to people, and understand that not everybody is going to judge you for talking to them about your experiences, and not everybody is out to have that gotcha moment with you where you say, I was in a cult, and somebody says, what do you mean you're in a cult? And you say, well, this happened to me. And then if you're talking to somebody that is respectful and trustworthy, and somebody who is actively listening instead of passively listening, then they shouldn't turn around and say, oh, well, you weren't in a cult because a cult is Charles Manson. It's much more in depth than that. And hopefully the people that we surround ourselves with, that we trust. And I know that we have never met before, so it's hard for me to say, like, talk to people that you know and trust, because that's kind of going against what I'm doing here today. But people that respect you shouldn't need you to explain why that happened. There shouldn't be a yes, got you moment, because that's not what comes with people listening and understanding. So hopefully the people that we do talk to and open up to can just listen and understand without needing proof or reasons for why things happened and how they happened, because they're your experiences and you're not making them up, and you know that they happened because you can remember them and you can still feel them. So hopefully people can respect that and not question your story, because you're just relaying it from the way that you've lived it. And hopefully people can take that from our episode and apply that to themselves, to keep open those lines of communication with loved ones involved in these types of situations, like your father spoke to with me. And it got quite emotional towards the end of my interview with your father, and I told him I need to go and have a glass of wine now. So I don't know if you listen to that episode, it might be a bit difficult at times for you to listen to some of the things that he said, but it was genuinely heartwarming and heartbreaking at the same time. So hopefully this segment can give a new perspective to some of the listeners on how to explore and understand their own situations, but also how to support loved ones and understand them as well. And then the takeaway from what you've just said there at the end is to be patient with yourself, don't blame yourself, and find somebody to talk to that you can trust. So I think that kind of sums everything up in a nice tidy little bundle. And just thank you so much for your time today, Alexandra. I really, really appreciate it. I feel so privileged to have had this interaction with you and your father. I feel like I've really gained some deep insight into the whole situation, and I just really appreciate your time and respect you and your father so much. So thank you.
Well, thank you. I really appreciate you letting me tell this story, and your willingness to sort of educate other people on it. I think it's so important, and I think who knows, it may not be the magic bullet, but I think education is important. And if we all sort of understood these kind of dynamics better in relationships and coercion, I think it might go a long way at sort of safe proofing our lives from these experiences. Although, like I said before, I think it can happen at any time, but maybe the more others around us are educated as well, we can help each other out and avoid these kinds of experiences.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, well, I'm going to log off, but thank you so much, Alexandra. Enjoy the rest of your day.
You too. Thanks so much.
Take care. Bye. I hope you enjoyed the last of this year's episodes. You can get in touch by emailing me at cultvaultpodcast@gmail.com or follow me on Twitter and Instagram @cultvaultpod. I'm your speaker, Casey, signing out for 2021, and this has been the Cult Vault.